mentioned, I understand that I've got readability issues on my slides for code. So for this example of how to mock out HTTP endpoints, I'm going to do it live. So first of all, this is a mock project that I have set up for the sake of a blog that I wrote. So I'm going to go ahead and start up the JSON server that we're going to end up mocking out. So you can see that it's running on localhost 3001. If you're not familiar with JSON Server, how this works is I will go to my endpoint, and I've got a data object defined in a JSON file here that has two items, user and FullUser. One represents a user summary, and the other has all the extra details. In this case, just the degree. So if I access that the HTTP endpoint, at the localhost 3001 and put user, which is the property of that first collection, you'll get the whole collection that is represented on the value of that property. So here you can see user maps to a array of users. In this case, it only has one. And when you hit that endpoint, you get that collection. If I were to do FullUser, which is the other property on that object, I get that other collection. So this is a pretty straightforward API, and one that we don't really have to think much about as far as mocking. But for the sake of this project, I wanted to start with something simple and understandable. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change out this portion of, we're going to do the equivalent of the user endpoint in Dyson. So as I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to npm install globally Dyson. You can choose to install Dyson generators if you want to take advantage of the dynamic generation of data. I personally don't like doing that. I'm more comfortable generating my own data just so I can guarantee the response. So we're going to go ahead and create a folder in our project that represents the mocks. I typically call it mocks just as a standard that I've been following, and we're going to replace the get endpoint of the services. So we're going to create a Git directory under mocks, which Dyson will pick up and serve all the endpoints that are exported in there as HTTP Git endpoints. So next, we're going to create a file, and I typically call it the name of the endpoint, and this is a JavaScript file. So we're going to do module.exports. And what this is doing is it's exporting a module to the node library. And what we're going to do is we're going to give it a path. This path is going to be /API/user. The reason the API is in there is because in our source code, you can see that the URL for a user is /API. The reason you don't see that on the JSON server is because I actually proxied it using the routes to change that API. That way I don't have to do extra nesting and all sorts of stuff in there. So anyway, we're going to have path, and we're going to point to API user, which will replace that endpoint. Next, we're going to provide it a template with what it's going to return. So in this case, it's an array. And we're going to say, we're going to take the same user, and we're going to just drop it in here. Right? Nothing fancy at this point. We're just doing a one-to-one replacement of the backend. This is probably an oversimplified example because I have access to the backend. But if you worked with a remote API team or somebody else who is doing your development for you, and I'm just trying to fix ESLint errors here, so I'm talking over myself while I'm doing it. But if you have a remote team that is responsible for your API, you can't get them to reproduce a particular scenario every time, or if you want to test edge cases that are really difficult to set up properly in a database, for instance, it's really nice to be able to mock these things out. I'll get into one thing that I found extremely useful in my previous job a bit later. So anyway, this represents an endpoint. That's all it took, was a simple configuration of this one object. and now I have a valid Dyson endpoint. So to show that off, we're going to go ahead and we're going to perform a Dyson, and we're going to do it on mocks. That's the name of the directory that you created that contains your mocked endpoints. And I actually did not install Dyson globally here, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm doing this on the other screen. I have an issue with, I didn't run VS Code as admin, so I need to do that out here. So npm install g Dyson. So while that installs, I'm going to go ahead and actually do the other endpoint while I'm at it. Again, we're just going to take the object. We're going to create a new file called FullUser.js, and we're going to copy. Let's actually just copy this portion so I don't have to do all that ESLint fixes here. So we're going to copy this. We're going to replace user with FullUser, and we're going to add the degree object onto that mocked object. And we're going to replace those. All right, so now we have two endpoints. We have the user and FullUser. The Dyson has installed globally, so now I should be able to Dyson mocks. All right. So you see Dyson listening at port 3000. I do believe I actually have an issue because I should have seen what endpoints it was listening at. So let's verify that. Yep, I have an issue. So you can see 404 not found. Dyson is actually really good about outputting error messages. So let's go ahead and try and figure out what I did wrong. All right, so after looking into it, it turns out that capitalizing Git in my folder structure of under mocks actually is what caused the issue. So you can get around this by doing method and then the HTTP method. I'm going to avoid doing that just because I prefer to rely on the folder name. Although after finding out that capitalization matters, I might reconsider that point. All right, so moving forward, one other feature of JSON Server is the ability to actually request a specific ID. So here you can see the mocked server running at port 3000, as well as the actual server running at port 3001. You see that the responses are the same. So here with JSON Server, it follows REST. So if I pass it an ID, it'll grab me that object. So you see the collection notation dropped off and it returned just the object representing the 0th item in that collection. So in order to mock that same behavior, as you can see it doesn't work, we're going to go ahead and we are going to add a GetUser by ID. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the same exact thing. We're going to add a path parameter at ID. And then we're going to take the template, we're going to cut that bad boy out, and we're going to say function path parameters. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the collection and we're going to say const users equals, and we're going to say give us the users at path parameter. Oh wait, I apologize. I need to do users.find, where the user.id is equal to path parameters.id. All right, so now let's go ahead and restart our JSON server. And you can see the third endpoint added here with the path parameter of ID. So let's go back to our mock. And let's go ahead and refresh. Here you can see it returned the ID of 0. If we attempted to do 1, we're going to get nothing in response. That's because it didn't find anything in that collection. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is something that I've actually found recently that is going to be pretty useful. So let's go ahead and create a new folder called data. And in this, we're going to say new file users.js. And we're going to do module.exports. And we're going to export the list of users in our response here. And then inside of user, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and require data users. And we're going to do the same up here. And then instead of users, we're going to say const users is equal to require data users. So what this will do is this will import that collection. So now if I make a change to either of them, you can see that it's executing exactly as we would expect. And if I wanted to go ahead and update my data to add an additional user, it says first name Tommy, last name Frankel, age 27, email tfranks@gmail.com. We're going to go ahead and we're going to add that user, and we're going to restart Dyson. And you'll see we have 2 entries now, and if I refresh at the 0th ID, I still get myself, and 1 we get Tommy. So that's the nice part of being able to do this in Node, is you can use require to kind of isolate that data. So now we have the users fleshed out. I'm going to go ahead and pause this and finish out the full users, and we'll move on once that's done. So through the magic of movies, I created the full user endpoint that quickly. Yep, just a few seconds. Anyway, so I can access the user at 0 and 1, and you can see the individual user responding as a result. So with that being said, let's go ahead and look at the actual web project. It's a simple web project right now that has just a list of the users, and if you click on it, it will show you the full user information. So let's say we have a use case now where we need to test what 2 users look like, but I can't get the API team to add a second user. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to swap to our mock, and you can see through our Webpack configuration that we have a proxy that's taking our API calls, and it's changing the location to HTTP localhost 3001. This represents our live data at our JSON server. So let's go ahead and cut that proxy out, and we're going to say JSON Server proxy. Next, we're going to also create our Dyson server proxy, and we're going to give it the same API proxy. And we're going to say for all URLs matching /API, we're going to give it a target of HTTP localhost 3000. As you recall, that's the default port that we're running Dyson on, and we're going to keep it that way. But now we need a way to switch between one or the other depending on what our use case is. Sometimes you want to use live data in order to ensure that you're not overlooking anything and that you get the full integration test. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a package called yargs, and we're going to require yargs.argv. So argv is a property on the yargs npm module, and we're going to go ahead and access the .mock, and we're going to say in the event of the mock argument being passed to the Webpack dev server, we're going to go ahead and use the Dyson server proxy. Otherwise, we want the JSON server proxy. So what Yargs does is it looks for arguments passed to the node process. So if we do a Webpack dev server and we pass it mock, what it should do is it should use our Dyson server proxy. So you can see through our Webpack configuration, we have a proxy created at /API. Apologize for this. At /API, and it will point to HTTP localhost 3000. So that means that we're actively sending HTTP requests at /API to our Dyson server. So now let's go ahead and show how this affects our app. You can see from the live reload that we now have Evan Williams and Tommy Frankel, and both the user and the full user is available. So you can see me swap between those two. So it's as simple as that. If I wanted to run against that JSON server again, I just drop off that mock argument and go back and look at our server. And you'll see that the response now correlates to what we have in our JSON server. Just Evan Williams is available. So what this highlights is how easy it is to swap out our Dyson mocks and our JSON server mocks. This is something that I've used in previous applications. And one extremely useful feature is being able to create specific cases. So let's go ahead and in our mocks folder in Git, we're going to say edge cases. And this application is extremely simple. So there really isn't any edge cases that we need to test, but for the sake of this demo, let's go ahead and say user's first name is long. So instead of returning our users object, we're going to return a very explicit first name. Evan is too short for the sake of this edge case. Last name is still Williams, surprisingly. Age 27, email williams.evan.m@gmail.com. All right, so what we need to do in order to differentiate as far as our edge case versus our user endpoint is we need to, and I forgot that this is at any given ID. It doesn't matter at this point. We just want to test this use case. So what we need to go ahead and do is we need to make it so that we are giving it a specific URL. So let's say edge case. So now if we go to our source code, and actually let's go ahead and test this out. So let's restart Dyson. So you can see API edge case user ID. So if I went to edge case user 1, you can see we get that use case. Sorry, I realized that was small. So you get the long first name. So let's go ahead and look at our code and ensure that Webpack's still running here, which it is. And let's change our production data here in services to point to, let's see, get user, get full user, get. All right, so user ID with user URL. So let's go ahead and change this to edge case. So what we're doing is we're now going to proxy this API call to our Dyson server, which has this special edge case in its URL. This edge case is useful for testing edge cases for error messages and the like. Just make sure that you delete them out of there before you get to production. So now let's look at the result. So if we go to our Webpack, you can see that as the reload occurred, we have a use case where my name is way too long, and now I have this odd scroll bar here. So that's a way to identify edge cases that may not have been tested, and it gives you an extreme example of how to use mocks to your advantage in order to thoroughly test your design and that sort of thing, and make sure your application works as intended when you reach those edge cases and how you handle errors. I found this aspect specifically valuable in my previous job. Recreating errors was an act of God because of how complicated our data systems were. So being able to systematically reproduce an error is extremely nice. One last thing I want to mention is the other nice aspect of Dyson is it gives you a way to basically replay a series of responses. So let's say I wanted to take this response and make sure that it was that it was up to date with live data from the server. I can simply go into my user mock and I can just drop in this list of data here live data from the server. I can then reproduce that live data for the rest of time. So if the API changes, I just go out and fetch this resource again from live data, throw it in my mock, and it'll serve that same response every single time. Now, this is extremely important when you have really long-winded services that take a very, very long time to come back. I would say that Dyson saved me multitudes of hours in my previous job because I implemented it early and I updated it often. So those are two things that I would also suggest if you go through with mocking your services. Hopefully this was useful. Please leave any sorts of comments down below. Reach out to me on Twitter. I really want to know what your guys' feedback is on this and how you are enjoying this format versus just the slides. And in addition, how you feel about my sudden change into more random topics. Also, if you have any suggestions, I'm always open to listening to those and potentially producing movies off of them. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you later.